morning, everyone. My name is Melanie Crofts, and I'm an Associate Professor in Law at De Montfort University. I have the honour and pleasure of opening this Breaking the Silence on Domestic Violence event. I will be talking about some of the challenges faced when trying to address violence against women, as well as highlighting some of the research which is taking place at DMU in this area, and the importance of hearing survivor voices. We will then have two great speakers, Jasvinder Sanghera, founder of Karma Nirvana, who will be engaged in conversation with Sunita Patel, and then Jess Phillips MP, Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding, who will be engaged in conversation with Professor Jo Richardson. I will leave Sunita and Jo to introduce the speakers later, but I hope you will find this event interesting and thought-provoking. As many people at this event will be aware, the issue of domestic abuse has received some media attention since the COVID outbreak and lockdown started. Many organisations providing support for survivors of domestic abuse have highlighted that there has been an increase in demand for specialist domestic abuse services, but also additional barriers caused by lockdown for those needing to access support. At the same time this has been happening, we are also seeing the passage of the Domestic Abuse Bill through Parliament, which was debated at committee stage in the House of Lords on Monday. The bill is most certainly welcome, although there are still shortcomings. In the debate on Monday in the House of Lords, there was much discussion about the issues affecting migrant women in particular, which I'll come back to in a moment. This week also saw the announcement from the government of £40 million additional money for rape and domestic abuse services. While any additional funding is welcome, I would suggest that this is a short-term sticking plaster, and arguably not even a very sticky sticking plaster, for an area which has been underfunded for many years and which requires secure, long-term funding in order to be able to provide the consistent and viable service for survivors. My local refuge, Wellingborough and East Northants Women's Aid, closed in 2016 due to lack of funding. As we are seeing with many charities and voluntary sector organisations, underfunding has come home to roost during the pandemic. However, I would like to return briefly to one area which is of particular interest to me and my colleagues, Professor Vanessa Bettinson and Dr. Sarah Jo Lee, who have been undertaking research in this area, that of the experiences and support provided to migrant women and racialised minorities. We have been involved with two pieces of research locally to evaluate the partnership working and multi-agency approach when providing support for survivors of domestic abuse, particularly women with more complex needs such as addiction and mental health issues. Another aspect which made supporting survivors of domestic abuse more complex is that of insecure immigration status, as well as other barriers often faced by migrant women, in particular, such as language barriers. It is therefore so important that specialist services provided to migrant women and other racialised minorities are not sidelined in the discussions about supporting survivors of domestic abuse, and are also properly funded. It was absolutely clear in the research we did that specialist support services of all kinds, but particularly those provided to migrant women, are vital for those women. As one woman herself explained about the support she received from Leicester-based service Panaga, "When I came here, I can't speak English. That's why I was really worried about outside, how to speak, because I can't explain everything. I was very worried about how to explain what happened with me. I can't explain everything. Panaga speak other languages and Panaga helped me. They gave me sessions, how to survive my new life." Language support was only one element of specialist support which Panaga could provide. Insecure immigration status is another element which provides significant barriers for women accessing support, and is something which also came through in our research. This is an issue which has been highlighted in the debates in Parliament during the passage of the Domestic Abuse Bill, and which organisations such as Southall Black Sisters have been consistently highlighting in their campaigns. The women we spoke to also spoke about issues such as their insecure immigration status being used as a means of further control and abuse, as it was used by perpetrators to threaten reporting them to the authorities and being deported. They also outlined the difficulties in accessing refuge support and being financially dependent on their abuser due to the rules on no recourse to public funds. A number of MPs, not least Jess Phillips, and members of the House of Lords have raised these issues as the Domestic Abuse Bill has passed through Parliament. The main areas of concern are that there should be recourse to public funds and access to benefits for all victims of domestic abuse, irrespective of their immigration status. This is to enable access to refuge services because often these are paid for by a housing benefit, as well as giving women some, albeit limited, financial independence. The data about immigration status should not be shared with the Home Office for immigration control purposes, so as to ensure that immigration status cannot be used as a further means of abuse, either by perpetrators or by state agencies. That the time limit of 3 months grace for applying for indefinite leave to remain should be increased to 6 months for those on spouse visas and extended to all other immigration categories, not just those on spouse visas. The complexities of dealing with immigration issues and the need for other services such as interpreters means that 3 months is often not sufficient for underfunded organisations to be able to provide adequate advice and support. So many of the concerns which have been raised during the passage of the bill are issues which we found when speaking to survivors of domestic abuse. And clearly organisations like Southall Black Sisters and Panaga have the direct experience of the barriers which prevent the effective support of migrant women survivors of domestic abuse. One thing we felt was so important in the research that we have been involved in is hearing the voices of the women impacted by domestic abuse. It is vital that in research such as this, we work to make visible the voices of those who are most marginalised and disempowered to ensure that they are heard and that their voices are key in informing government policy and changes to legislation. Breaking the silence on domestic violence cannot happen without amplifying those voices. We are incredibly grateful to those women who agreed to take part in our research and who retold painful experiences and invested so much emotional labour to tell their stories. The final aspect I want to briefly talk about is this notion that domestic abuse is gender neutral. The issue which often gets raised when we talk about domestic abuse and violence against women is that men are victims of and survivors of domestic abuse too. This is clearly also the case. However, acknowledging that men also experience domestic abuse and require adequate support services does not mean that gender is irrelevant when it comes to domestic abuse and gender-based violence. As Lord Paddock stated in the House of Lords when discussing the Domestic Abuse Bill, the true picture of the levels of abuse is unclear, in part because of the pressure to conform to the traditional, socially accepted norm of male-dominated heterosexual relationships. Therefore, feminist critiques about the damaging constructions of gender which harm women and the patriarchal norms which have a direct effect on the position and role of women are relevant when it comes to considering the issue of domestic abuse. Notions of masculinity and femininity, which are perpetuated in patriarchal society, are not only the cause of oppression of women, but are also the reason why men may not feel able to come forward to seek help when they experience domestic abuse, for fear of being ridiculed as not manly enough. However, the context in which men experience abuse is different. The abuse women experience is set within a context of historical, ingrained, and systematic oppression. Therefore, although male victims should be acknowledged and supported, domestic abuse is not gender neutral. To address it as such would be to ignore the reality and context of women's experiences and would threaten the provision of specialist support services, particularly for those women who experience multiple forms of oppression, such as migrant women, racialised minorities, disabled women, and women from LGBTQ+ communities, for instance. I'd like to finish by giving a shout out to the amazing work which Mandala Project does at De Montfort University in supporting students who are survivors of domestic abuse and sexual violence, as well as the recently launched No Space for Hate campaign, which aims to challenge inappropriate behaviours and provide practical support to students who are victims, survivors, or witnesses of hate or harassment. There are also moves to introduce something similar for staff. I'd also like to mention the great work of my colleague, Professor Vanessa Bettinson, as she does a lot of work and research in relation to coercive control and domestic abuse. And I'd like to highlight that we have a sexual violence and domestic violence research network at De Montfort, which is co-chaired by Vanessa and another colleague, Di Turgoose. There is a lot of work which is going on around the topic at the university, and I apologise for the fact that I'm unable to make reference to all the work and research which is going on to address violence against women and girls. I'm pleased to work for a university in which having these kinds of conversations are at the forefront of what the organisation stands for. De Montfort's commitment to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which includes a commitment to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, sends an important message about who we are. I was also encouraged to see a message to staff from our new Vice-Chancellor, Professor Katie Normington, this week, which set out her commitment to the equality agenda. However, there is clearly still a lot of work still to be done, and organisations, including De Montfort, are far from perfect and have to reflect on the action to address the continuing systemic and institutional inequalities, harassment and violence which affect women within the organisation. So I really hope that you enjoy the rest of the morning and find it challenging and insightful. And I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Sunita. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mel, and good morning. Good morning. My name is Sunita Patel. I am a public engagement manager here at DMU. I work within DMU Local, which is our public engagement function, within SIE, which is Strategic Impact and Engagement, as a directorate. And it's an absolute pleasure and honor to be here today and to be able to introduce our first speaker of this event, Jasvinder Sanghera, and to engage in hopefully what I hope will be an informative, thought-provoking conversation around some of the themes that Mel just set out in her introduction. Before I go on to introduce Jasvinder, just wanted to make you all aware that we're hoping to take as many questions as possible from yourselves. So whilst we will set some time to the end of the session to take those, please do send them through as you think of them, and we'll try and weave them into the conversation where relevant as well, to make sure that we try and mimic as much of a real life 3D experience as possible through this virtual forum. So I'm going to move on to introduce our first speaker. So Jasvinder Sanghera has often been described as a political advisor, a subject matter expert, and a human rights campaigner. She was awarded a CBE in 2013, amongst many other highly recognized awards. She's been close to us here at De Montfort University through various ways. She received an honorary doctorate back in 2018. She's been a member of our board, and she's also helped set up and influence and advise that Mandala project, which Mel spoke about in her introduction as well. So well known to the organization. A survivor of forced marriage herself, she's the founder of Karma Nirvana, which is a national charity that supports both men and women affected by honor-based abuse and forced marriages. She's a highly acclaimed speaker internationally and across the country, and has been recognized really to bring the issue of forced marriage into the public domain. So it's an absolute pleasure and an honor to be able to welcome Jasvinder here to us this morning, and just wanted to say I hope you are well, and I hope that you are going to enjoy this hour that you're going to spend with us. So welcome, Jasvinder, and good morning.
Good morning. Good to be here. Thank you.
I thought we could start with perhaps just hearing from you a little bit about your journey so far, the background, but also bringing us all into that sort of space and setting a bit of context for today. So if I hand over to you to just share a little bit with us, and then we can go into a few more of those themes as we go on.
Sure. Well, good morning to all of you that have logged in, and thank you for your time this morning. I'll start at the beginning for those who probably haven't heard me speak before, and just share a little bit about myself and my upbringing and my background and my family and what makes me who I am. So my father came into this country in the late 1950s from rural Punjab in India to work. And like many migrants, he was invited to this country to work. He settled in Derby, was the local town we were raised. My mother joined him later on, and I am one of 7 sisters, and I have one brother. So my family were a traditional Sikh family, and we all went to British schools. But over, let's say, 45 years ago, I watched the majority of my sisters being taken out of the classroom in a British classroom. Marry a man they'd only ever met in a photograph. I remember this very clearly because what my family actually did was they married as an order of age. So I watched this happen to at least 4 of my sisters, and I have one sister younger than me. And they would disappear and go to India with my mother. She was the one that would take them. And then they would come back after a long absence. And this time they'd be back as somebody's wife. Their appearance changed. They had a wedding ring on their finger. And some of them didn't go back to school, albeit my sister Rubina did go back to school. And we have a 2-year age gap between us. But she was put into my class at school with a 9-month absence that nobody ever questioned. So when it was my turn, I came home from school at the age of 14, and my mother sat me down and she presented me with this photograph of this man who I was to learn I was promised to at the age of 8. And I remember looking at this photograph as a 14-year-old who just had a day at school, normal day at school, and thinking, he's shorter than me, he's older than me, and I don't want to marry a stranger. And it was simple as that for me. And my mother, I suppose, it is true to say, has never been challenged. So for her, it was a challenge. Here's a daughter who's saying no, whereas all my other sisters did it without question. And I can say that because by the time they got to my mother telling them this was the man they were going to be married, I would always describe it now as they were suitably groomed, they were suitably conditioned. So I said no. I'm not marrying a stranger. I want to go to school, dare I say, college or university. And my mother was very clear that where I was going, I don't need an education. And in fact, I only send you to school because it's the law. So I went back to school and I protested more and more when I got to the age of 15 and a half. And that was because I knew the time was getting close. And that was when my parents saw me as a threat to this marriage, in that it's not going to happen. And they couldn't take that risk because once a promise of marriage has happened, it's hugely shameful to not honour that promise of marriage. So they took me out of education, and I was held a prisoner in my own home. And when I mean prisoner, I mean locked in a room with the padlock on the outside of the door and not being allowed to leave that room until I agreed to the marriage. In that time, I can only describe it as, and for many victims out there hearing this and survivors will understand the feelings of when your family gang up on you. That's what they do. The people that are meant to love you the most are doing this to you. And it is the most paralyzing feeling in the world because you're made to feel that you did this to them. You are the bad guy, you are the perpetrator. And in that feeling, you feel incredibly isolated. And I attempted to take my life by taking an overdose. And my family refused medical treatment for me because their fear was she's going to tell somebody in the hospital. So, even that cry for help didn't work. So in the end, I agreed to the marriage purely to plan my escape. And that was when I did plan my escape because, I was allowed out of the room, some freedom of movement around the house. I could see this was happening. The plans were happening in front of me. Your wedding day is meant to be one of the happiest days of my life. And here was these wedding preparations happening in front of my eyes. And it almost felt like an out-of-body experience, that I've got a bird's eye view watching this from up here, but it happens to be my wedding. I ran away when I was 16 years old to make the point I was born here in Britain. I should have the right to an education and the right, if I choose to, marry in the future whom I want to, and certainly the right to have freedom and independent thought. Britain is a democracy. Surely this is my right, and it should be something that should be embraced. But as we know, forced marriages rob women of all these rights. The one thing I did not imagine was the position that my family would take, because I ran away to Newcastle up north as a hiding place in the hope that they would see sense. They would think, right, she's made a point now, she can come back. When I was traced by the police, the officer back then, 42 years ago, basically said to me, he'd seen this before. And for me, that was a revelation, because he wasn't going to, well, he believed me. He believed this could happen, because even as a campaigner in my early days, it was really difficult to get people to comprehend these forced marriages, abuse that's happening in Britain. People would think of it as happening over there somewhere in a foreign country, but not in England. But he basically believed me and told me that he wouldn't tell my family where I was, but I need to ring home to say I was safe and well, which is what I did. And the thing I couldn't comprehend was my mother's choice. And it was a choice. I was 16, and my mother's choice was this: you either come back and marry who we say, or from this day forward, you are dead in our eyes. So the choice was estrangement from your family, or marry this stranger, conform to an honor system that deprives you of rights and freedoms, and marry a stranger, So I chose not to go back, thinking, oh, they'll get over it and they'll talk to me one day. But they didn't. And subsequently, my family disowned me. And that path of feeling unworthy as somebody who'd done this to the family, as somebody who was a perpetrator, stayed with me for at least 9 years, right up until the point where I'm sure we'll talk about my sister Rabina committed suicide. And I still am disowned, and as are my children and now my 3 grandsons. So on their side, of their mother's side, one of their family talked to them. So, and that was subsequently how I became a campaigner and developed Carbon in 1993.
Mm. That's thank you for sharing, first of all. When you talk sort of through your journey, words like forced marriage, honor-based violence, honor killings, religious guilt, cultural guilt, those themes come up, that those words are used. And whilst they might be used and people are more familiar with them, they might still not be quite sort of widely understood. So I was wondering if you could perhaps define some of those for us in your own words, based on your own experience.
Sure. I think the first thing to note is that an arranged marriage is a valued tradition that has been around for centuries, and arrangements of marriage happen within families. But the key thing to note about that is that there is an element of choice. There has to be. So one or both parties can say yes or no to the arrangement, and then it is accepted. So it is not rocket science to understand what the opposite of that is. It's force, it's coercion, it's being told that you have to marry this man, you don't, or woman, you don't have a choice. This is what you have to do. So that duress and that pressure is the force, and that's what constitutes a forced marriage. And that, in this country, is now against the law, a campaign that I fought for many years to create a criminal offence. So that's a forced marriage. But what we also have to have regard for is how many children, under the age of 16 years old, are being coerced into these marriages. And they do that through the system of honor-based abuse. And the way to describe that is, if anybody out there has seen the legislation of coercive and controlling behaviour, for me, that describes an honor-based system. A system that continuously over the years is where perpetrators construct a pattern of behaviour that is designed to deprive you of your rights, for you to become dependent on individuals, not independent. A system that makes you question your own realities, actually. And that, for me, is the conditioning that I talked about. So from a young age, my parents, and it was my parents, parents are in a position of trust. Parents are in a position of power. So as young people, you're going to look up to them and listen to them. You learn your rights and wrongs from them. So they have the power to tell you what is right and wrong. But in an honor system, they root it in the power dynamics of honor and shame. So they will say, you have to marry who we say, because this is our religion, this is our culture, this is our tradition, this is being obedient. Women have to be submissive because it is shameful not to. So you can't cut your hair, you can't wear makeup, you can't look at boys, let alone date boys. Grow up with these consistent messages. But the important thing to remember in that is that you understand these are the rules, and if you go against them, then you are going to be punished. If you go against them, then you're fearful because you have now crossed the line. You've shamed the family. I describe my mother was the master conductor of this honor system because she was the key carer. She was the parent forcing discipline and punishment. And the orchestra were the other family members that followed suit. So an honor system is something that people from many minority groups understand in terms of conforming to the family. And what the family will do is they will justify it in the name of their religion, in the name of tradition, in the name of culture. So my mother would say, which is absolute rubbish, by the way, that in Sikhism, it is your duty as a woman to marry who we say. In Sikhism, it is your duty as a woman, not to cut your hair. Well, when you look at Sikhism, and I did explore it as my dissertation, actually, Sikhism is built on the foundation of equality of both men and women. But the messages we get as growing up, we can't challenge those with our family or community because we're ill-informed and we're men.
And it's where the culture and religion sort of gets, those lines often get blurred. And I know you've spoken in the past around the support agencies and the professionals in this area being able to distinguish between culture and safeguarding, and being very clear on what and being well informed as to not being able to for people to be able to hide behind those notions that, well, that's just our culture, and then putting up that wall. So I think that's really interesting. You mentioned your sister a little bit in your introduction about kind of her journey and subsequently what happened to your sister, who you were in touch with, I understand, sort of even after the family disowned you. And often you hear when people hear stories of domestic abuse or very sort of coercive relationships, well, why don't you just leave, he or she? Why didn't she just leave? And I know that you have mentioned in the past that you encouraged your sister at the time to leave and just come and stay with you, and you would sort of look after her, and you could start again together. What's your response when you hear people just sort of say, well, why don't you just leave? It's England, it's a democracy, we've got all these support agencies, why don't you just leave?
Well, the first thing to acknowledge is that for me, it takes immense amount of courage to stay, and some people do choose to stay. I know when I made that choice when I was 16, some victims go back to their families and they conform and they marry that stranger because the thought of life without their family is so immense and not being able to survive. That takes courage too. So for every individual, I would say, they're on their journey, right? There are many challenges and barriers for any victim in terms of making that decision to leave. Now, in this space, in terms of the issues I'm talking about of honor abuse, forced marriage, female genital mutilation also, the big challenge for us is that it's understanding that what is happening to us isn't wrong, because we've been conditioned to believe that this is part of our responsibility, our duty. So if I look at my sister Rabina, who suffered horrific domestic abuse, what she would say when I used to talk to her in secret, come on to me and I'll protect you. And the reason I said that was because whenever she went to my family, and the community leader was rolled out to talk to her as well, a very senior member who is the voice of influence in the community, they all encouraged her to go back to her husband because it would be hugely shameful to leave him. So what Rabina was doing was she was putting this concept of family honor before keeping herself safe. So that will prevent people from leaving because the sheer pressure of that, because in her mind to leave, well, people won't talk to me, I'll be isolated. I could be at risk. They could use my children as a weapon to take them off me. You know, I'm out there on my own in a court system. The whole family will gang up on me and demonstrate how, you know, they can take care of these children. And then some women go back because of the children. So every case is different. But the important thing about these cases is the victims are incredibly isolated and face estrangement. And as your colleague mentioned earlier, another reason for staying is insecure immigration status, where that is being used as a weapon to keep that person there.
Yeah.
So leaving is a very personal decision. And for me, we have to reach the victim and help them to understand that. And many victims still say this today is, I thought I was the only one. You know? So helping people to understand they're not the only one and they're not alone is key. Getting the information to them from a point of reference of understanding. There's nothing worse than experiencing honor abuse or forced marriage and having to explain to a professional what it is. And then telling your story and retelling your story. So that level of understanding is also important.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And you know, through your journey, not only did you make your choice, and you know, the consequences of that in terms of your family are there to be seen and heard through your work, but you also set up Karma Nirvana all those years ago. Could you tell us a little bit more about how that came about? What made you take that step to set something up which 25 years or more later is still a very strong organization that supports many victims of this sort of abuse and violence?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the catalyst for establishing Karma Nirvana was the death of my sister Rubina. So, you know, we walked to school together, we shared a bed together, we had a life together as a younger sister, and she disappeared at 15 to India, came back after 9 months and was now somebody's wife, and nobody questioned that in school, you know, and asked questions, not even where she'd been for 9 months. And then later on, my sister left that man because it was an abusive relationship. And then she married for love, which is quite an alien concept, because in an arranged marriage, you're meant to grow to love somebody. You know, the kind of idea of falling in love with somebody, the normal courting way you would do it, isn't something that my family would accept. But they did with Rubina because he ticked all the boxes. So he was Sikh, he was the same caste, he was the same standing. So they allowed him to marry. What they said to her was, you've made your bed, now you have to lie in it. So in a way, you're setting yourself up to fail because you've married for love, but you get on with it. And in that relationship, she suffered horrific abuse, you know, the physical, mental abuse. She went backwards and forwards to my family. They sent her back for the sake of honor. And in the end, my sister set herself on fire and she committed suicide in her, you know, early 20s and died. And I remember being told by my mother not to come to the house, not to show my face. This doesn't change anything in relation to my position of unworthiness and estrangement. But I wanted to grieve my sister, you know, I wanted to be at the funeral. And I remember going to the funeral against their wishes, people walking out of rooms that I walked in. I remember the comments people were making. And these comments were, it was better for her to take her life than for her to dishonor her family and to leave a husband and to be a divorcee. And I was so angry that her life is gone. I actually still believe people have blood on their hands. They could have prevented that. And it was that conviction and that energy that made me believe that something has to change. You know, we need to tell people this is happening. You know, that's when I started to develop Karma Nirvana in '93 and started to share my own experiences for the first time and that of Rubina's. And I wanted people to hear this. I wanted them to hear the injustice of this. This is what is happening. And I always fundamentally believed that there were many more out there, that me and my sister were one of many, and that we were just not hearing them. I always believed that.
What progress do you think, you've been in the thick of it for the last 25 years or more, on a positive, what progress do you think has been made when it comes to forced marriages and honour killings, and the way in which we as a society and as a country tackle that issue? Have you seen anything sort of move and shift, and what does that look like for you?
I always make the point that nobody gave us anything as campaigners. We've had to fight for it, and government didn't give us a criminal offence. We had to fight for it. So the progress for me, the biggest achievement is the reporting. In the first 7 years of Carmen of Honor, the helpline started in my front room. I would be lucky if in the first 7 years we got 10 calls, but I knew they were out there. It was just about me raising awareness about this. So now we've got a national helpline that receives over 900 calls every month. You've got a government forced marriage unit. You've got police forces establishing forced marriage units. But nationally, victims are reporting. That's the important thing. That's of people are coming forward. The other progress is the fact that we have got civil and criminal legislation designed to tackle this issue of forced marriage. And people are sitting up and listening and talking about it. Breaking the silence was always important for me, because there was a disbelief this was happening, but now people are talking about this. We're talking about this. In 93 to 97, I was lucky if I could get more than 2 people to hear what I had to say. But now people are breaking the silences, recognizing this for what it is, abuse, and we're protecting individuals. So for me, the progress has been the journey of breaking the silences, the legislation that we have, the fact that we are a country that acknowledges that this abuse is happening to those born in this country, because that's really important. And that progress is something that is continuing as we go along, and that's the important thing. Is because I would say, wouldn't I, there's still a lot more to do, because there is. And right now Carmen of Honor are campaigning to change the law for the age of marriage. So in this country you can marry at the age of 16 with parental consent. What we want to do is raise it to 18, because we know at 16 parental consent is coerced. And if we look at the very 2 convictions of forced marriage, in both those cases, those young girls who are under the age of 15 were being coerced. So in the Birmingham case, the young girl was 13 years old when her mother took her to Pakistan and forced her to marry a stranger. Remember, if you're married, if you're forced to marry, you're going to be raped on your wedding night. She came back. Mother's defense in court was she never said no. That was the mother's defense. But that girl, as I described to you earlier, has had years and years of conditioning. You didn't have the power to be able to say, but I don't want this, Mum, Dad, because I'm special.
So there's still work to be done, as you mentioned, around sort of support agencies, working with communities. I wouldn't be able to hold an event during these times without acknowledging the so-called elephant in the room, the pandemic, and the impact in which what you've seen in terms of the national picture, but also the impact of the pandemic when it comes to this particular issue around forced marriages, but also domestic abuse within a cultural / religious setting. What is it? Is the picture different according to that, or what are you seeing at the moment? What's the current situation?
So for people listening to this, what I'd like them to imagine is a victim of honour abuse or forced marriage being in a household that they've known all their life, with family members surrounding them, the people that they've grown up with, parents, brothers, sisters. And then there comes a point within that family where they're saying, no, I don't want to marry a stranger, or they are rebelling against an honour system that deprives them of rights and independence. And I want you to imagine for that victim what happens, because everybody gangs up on you and they are punishing you for not towing the line. So that person during this pandemic has not got the eyes and ears of school, is not able to find an opportunity to be able to talk to a friend about this, report it in the same way. Because in a way, I believe this, the pandemic has given strength to the perpetrators. It's a huge opportunity to further isolate these victims. And when I was watching and listening in the age of pandemic to Refuge talking about 100% and 200% increase to their helpline, I asked the question and I contacted their CEO. Could you tell me what reporting looks like for minority women? Now, I mean all minority women here. And because Carmen and Ivana were telling me their reporting has gone down. Women are the helpline statistics are going down for children, for victims, men and women. So that led to discussions with Refuge and conversations with the Home Office as well, because I was challenging them. They were pouring funding into this national helpline that they rely on. That is not a specialist helpline. Okay, just fantastic work. And then what appeared was the statistics for minority women were less than 5%. They were very low. And so what do we do in this space to increase reporting for these women who are further isolated during a pandemic because of living with multiple perpetrators? So that led to broader discussions between Refuge and Carmen Ivana in partnership to tackle this, and the Home Office, thankfully, acknowledging that there needs to be more awareness and a campaign about this, which Carmen Ivana are leading on now. But the point here is that we don't have our children and young people who are the most affected group in school now for teachers to spot this happening. I believe that when we are out of the pandemic, we're going to see an influx of people taking these people abroad for the purposes of marriages that have been arranged or been coerced, should I say, because they haven't had the opportunity to take them during the pandemic. It's going to happen because those people they've been promised to can bide their time because of the pandemic. But as soon as that's lifted, there will be the greater expectation for these marriages to happen. And that's where we're going to see the greatest risk.
Yes, yeah. So there's still a bit of a long road ahead. And I can imagine support agencies and communities are working really hard at the moment to try and engage and sort of get to the bottom of and reach as many people as they can in these difficult times. And I can fully appreciate that that's a challenge. So Carmen Ivana, you stepped away from sort of leading it actively on the sort of forefront, and you've handed it over to the next generation of leadership when it comes to Carmen Ivana. I can imagine that the fuel to the fire that you mentioned earlier, the passion kind of about righting the wrong that you'd seen from sort of Rubina's experience and wanting to really go forward with that must have taken its own toll on you personally, because you're sharing your personal story over and over again. Could you tell me a little bit about how it feels to sort of step away a little bit from the daily runnings of Carmen and Ivana and what that's actually meant for you in your journey? What's the next step for you?
You see, Carmen Ivana for me, and I acknowledge this later on, and not at the time, and this is a journey that I'm on right now, I suppose, was a good hiding place. Because actually, what Carmen Ivana was a place where I poured all the trauma of what happened to me, the pain, and it became a conviction, and it consumed me. And that passion in itself was driving the work of the charity, which is a good thing, but not necessarily a healthy thing on an individual, actually. But I went and carried on, and it came to the point where I decided after 25 years to step down, and it was a very personal decision for me, because there was always a reason to stay another year and another year and another year, because I used to say I'll stay until forced marriage is criminalised, or I'll stay until the funding for the helpline is secured, and there'll always be another reason. I'd still be there now. But then I had to make a conscious decision, actually, because it was time to think about me. And also, it was time for the younger generation to take it forward. Nobody wants a founder hanging around for too long, actually. So it's giving me the space and time, I suppose, to reflect on my own journey. Actually, using a word like trauma was a difficult thing to acknowledge for myself. Very good at helping other people, but actually to understand the experiences of that 16-year-old girl, grieving the loss of my own sister. I don't suppose I've really done that. Trying to rationalize and process the experiences, it is something that time now allows me to do. And I suppose that is a journey that I should have done a long time ago. But I haven't done that. But it's happening now. I've worked so hard, I suppose, to separate my past from my present, and I've done that very well and built a very purposeful wall in that space. But right now I'm taking the wall down, I suppose, and trying to understand it and comprehend it in a different way, which is also something I'm writing about.
Yeah, speaking of your writing, what's something we haven't mentioned so far, talked about, is that you have written 3 books at various stages. The first one being Shame, followed by Daughters of Shame, and the last one was about sort of returning back to India and sort of rediscovering some of those cultural roots. You've used the word shame in every single title, and I will come back to the book that you're currently writing. But I thought we could step back and think a little bit about what you've already published and all your kind of work that's gone into that. But the word shame appears in every single title, and I suspect there's a reason for that.
Yeah, how can it not? Because the experience of shaming one's family and being a shameful daughter, and shame underpins all your decision making growing up. So it seats at the heart of somebody that lives within a family dynamic where they operate an honor system. But given the book title Shame and then Daughters of Shame, then Shame Travels, what I actually was doing was reclaiming the word shame. I'm taking it back. And I say to those people that are doing this, my honor is your shame. That's what I'm saying. So I reclaim it in a powerful way, actually. And it's about taking it back, because I sit here today and, you know, my family and some people in the community as well do not see me as an honorable woman. I don't care about that anymore. One of the things I've had to unlearn in my journey of being conditioned is we are raised to live our lives according to how other people see us and our family, according to what other people think. I don't do that anymore. You know, as long as I live my life in terms of being a decent human being that cares, actually, you know, I turn the word shame around in that I've reclaimed it. I see myself as an honorable person, not somebody who's shameful in the way my family would have me believe. And that's why I reclaimed it. Does
shame in your through what you're saying, is it culturally different, the word shame? Do you think it means different things to different cultures?
Yeah.
That notion of shame, you know, the strength of that word. So I think it's even more powerful, isn't it, to reclaim it within the context in which you're reclaiming it, due to those kind of, like you say, ingrained notions, and how linked honor and shame and how powerful that is in certain communities.
Absolutely. And everybody listening to this right now will have a concept of what is honorable to them. You know, what is deemed shameful to them. The point for me is that for me, it was skewed growing up, because it was a concept that I had to adhere to that controlled my life. And I wasn't free to come up with my own independent thinking of what was honorable and shameful to me. So, you know, and over time, the concept of honor and shame changes, doesn't it? I mean, in the 30s, 40s, let's say, you know, you'd be shameful if you were a single mother. It's just by society as being shameful, you know, for not being married. But now that concept has changed. But with the times, but within my family dynamic, that would still be deemed as shameful and hugely dishonorable.
Yeah.
So
understanding those nuances.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the focus of your new book, then, Jasvinder, if you know the journey has been to this point where now you do have that confidence to reclaim, or you reclaim the word shame for yourself and all of that. What is the focus of your new book? What are you thinking about at the moment? What's important to put on paper?
Like my book Shame, that was a difficult book to write, because I had to unearth every stone to tell the story of what happened. But the one thing, and it was an honest story, and this book will be very honest as well, and people who know me will know I talk very candidly and very honest, because that's part of the conversation, I believe. It's almost like me looking at what happened to me, but through a lens of today. The reason I say that is because having left Karma Nirvana, I am now beginning to understand and process some of what happened to me. You know, I said Karma Nirvana was a good hiding place for me. Well, actually, there is trauma there. There are these experiences where I'm trying to rationalize and understand my mother, and how, being a mother myself and a grandmother now, how could a mother treat her daughter in that way, and trying to process that and grieve some of the loss that I've had. And recently, I've acknowledged that I myself have triggers in my life. And my brother died 2 months ago. And when you're by your family, you're lucky if you get to hear about people that have died. And it was my daughter actually that said, you know, Mum, I need to sit you down and tell you something. And she read it on Facebook. So I remember looking on Facebook with my daughter and seeing this old man who is now in his 60s, whom I remember when I was 16 years old. And I think about the time in between that we've completely lost. And it really knocked me back and impacted on me. So the book is going to be a universal book, I believe, in terms of there are many people out there that are estranged by their families, you know, and one of the common causes is abuse or religion, actually. And I think for me, it's about understanding some of that in the context of how I feel today and looking back and trying to describe some of that to give people a deeper understanding that, you know, emotional intensity really helps to set the memory. And fear is the most intense emotion of all. That's because, you know, you have a lot more to learn from fear. So all those where I've chosen to not deal with, I'm dealing with, but I'm writing about them now as well. And I'm hoping it will give people hope too.
Yeah, that's a powerful thing to have to put yourself through, but also I believe would be something hopefully that people could, like you say, take something from and learn from. Because I think that notion of you're kind of in psychology, I guess it's a sort of this notion of childhood trauma and the decisions that it then kind of leads you to make in an adult sort of when you're living your adult life. But that sort of post-traumatic stress, which is what it is, that you through sheer will of survival and wanting to make a difference and supporting hundreds and hundreds of people over the years has probably not had the space, like you said, to actually play out. And I guess what you're saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that you're taking some time to unpack some of that. And through that, you must have come across things as an adult now that you obviously weren't equipped with the knowledge or the experience to deal with when you were 16. What would you, if you were to meet your 16-year-old self again, or any 16-year-old finding themselves in a situation like you did, what would you say? What would you want to pass on at that stage?
For me, it's an easy thing to pass on, but a very difficult thing for that 16-year-old. And that would be for me to tell that person that you didn't do anything wrong. You're not the bad guy. You're not the perpetrator. And the reason I say that is because I carried that from 16 to 24 when Rabina died. And it did all sorts of things to me, internalizing guilt, shame, there was depression, there was anxiety, there were all these things. And when I think about if we own that sooner and somebody helps us on that path to understanding that this is about family abuse, this is what your family have done to you, you know, you haven't done anything wrong here. What you've done is quite brave, actually, and bring them on that path. If I got onto that path sooner, my healing would have been sooner. So I would say, you know, keep going and own sooner that you're not the perpetrator.
Yeah.
You have got honor, is what I would say.
Yeah. You mentioned that you've got a daughter, and you're a mother yourself, and you did touch upon earlier on your kind of own relationship with your own mum and how actually it was your mum that delivered that message of, you know, either come back or that's it. You know, you're no longer part of this family, and carried that through even to most recent years. You know, that still is, you're still not able to engage with your family in the way which which you might have hoped at the time that, in time that will all resolve itself, because come on, it's your family, that notion of, being a mother yourself, reflecting on your relationship with your mom, her journey, how, culturally the system might have impacted her. How do we break that cycle? Do you feel like you're breaking the cycle?
Well, and in fact, this is part of my writing as well, because I'm trying to understand my mother's role in all of this. Bless her, her reinforcing my position of unworthiness happened for many years. But then, as a mother, it's making me look at it completely differently. And in fact, I'm trying to have more, I move from scale to scale. It's the how can a mother do that to actually having some empathy as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because I see my mother as a victim of a system in herself, in what was happening, but that doesn't make it right. And for me, one of the biggest decisions that keeps me grounded, I suppose, in all of this is that my children will never have to inherit a legacy of abuse, and grandchildren. Okay, on their mother's side, they haven't got any family. But that 16-year-old who was making that decision on that day was making it for her children in the future. And that's something else I would tell that 16-year-old, actually. And I didn't know that at the time. So it's knowing that they are independent, they are strong individuals, they're together as people. And it's important that all children want to be is to receive unconditional love and regard.
Mm.
In fact, I look back now and I think I actually protected my children from my family. That's how I see it.
Mm-hmm.
That's important. And that helps me understand that my children haven't gone without, because nobody wants their children to go without. No. I think those of us who have been broken become experts at mending. And right now, it's trying to understand and process quite a lot in that space. You use the word PTSD. I would never have identified myself as having PTSD. But actually, this time and space is giving me, with it not being in Karma Nirvana, a space to actually understand some of these concepts as they impact me. And that's okay.
Yeah, no, that's true. Thank you, Jasvinder. We've got some questions coming in, and I'm just conscious of time. I could probably talk to you all day if I had the opportunity, but I'm going to bring in some questions from some of the people who are attending the event today. They're sort of practical in nature, but hopefully we can kind of pull them a bit together. I've got a question here from Chris Hall, and he's asking about data around how many forced marriages there are in the UK each year, and sort of stats around kind of the scale, I guess, of the issue here in the UK.
Yeah. So, Chris, it's a good question. And one thing I will start with, and this is when I do agree with government, is that they would say that we're dealing with the tip of the iceberg, that beneath the iceberg, there are thousands of underreported cases that we have yet to know about. And you could say that about many forms of abuse because of the hidden nature. But in terms of statistics, I would look at the government's Forced Marriage Unit website, and because they deal with those victims who are at risk of being taken out of the country. They got stats of how many children have been taken out of the country, as young as 5 years old. And, Karma Nirvana is another one. What I can tell you from my time of being at Karma Nirvana, when it became a helpline from 2007 to 2018, the helpline had dealt with in the region of around 85,000 calls to the helpline. But I know that calls now are increasing because we've also got the online. So it's difficult for me to give you an actual number, but please know the stats are out there. Start with Karma Nirvana's Forced Marriage Unit, but recognize that it's totally underreported. Think about the 7-year-old who's been promised into a marriage and already engaged at 7 years old. Do we know about that person? Or the 14-year-old whose family have said we're going on holiday abroad, but actually they've been coerced in going abroad for the purpose of a marriage. So there are lots that we don't know about.
Thank you. Actually, I'm going to bring in a question from Michelle, because she's asking about what can be done to ensure children leaving the country, because you just mentioned there about very young children as well being sort of taken across to foreign lands to sort of be promised away or to make those arrangements in the countries where the parents are from or originate from. what support can something be done to ensure children leaving the country are given support and an opportunity at the airport, etc., to discuss in private?
You see, from my perspective, by the time somebody gets to the airport, it's really too late. Okay, this is why schools are at the heart of it. You know, we've got to be talking about this in schools. That's where you're going to prevent it. And I mean, you know, from young ages upwards. So if children in schools that have been educated to believe this is normal within their family dynamic because of conditioning, imagine the power of getting a counter message. You know, forced marriage is against law in this country. This is what it is. If you're at risk, talk to your teacher. This is what you need to do. So there needs to be the training of teachers to spot it, but also, you know, healthy relationships becomes mandatory for every school to have to do PHC lessons from September this year. What I'm really hoping, and I'm the independent safeguarding chair for the Children's Board in Leeds, is that we can get every school to talk about domestic abuse in terms of healthy relationships, what isn't, but within that also be talking about child and forced marriage. So, you know, my hope is that schools will get on board with this, because that's where you're going to prevent it. By the time you get to the airport, the hope is that somebody will talk to somebody, and Carmen Nirvana have trained airports to respond to it, but it really does become a bit late.
Yeah, I've seen some posters at the back of toilet doors, etc. I saw that campaign a few years ago. But I guess that further proves the point, you know, with the world we're living in currently, with school closures, that regular contact with other adults, an opportunity to leave the home under sort of legitimate reasons to attend education, but also that being sort of a refuge or somewhere to seek help and talk about it is suddenly not the case, and hasn't been the case for best parts of 6-7 months in this country. So that is a challenge, I'm guessing, that the support agencies will be looking at the moment.
I can tell you, Sunita, from my own personal experience, and for many of these victims out there, that school was the only place I could have freedom, an element of free thought and independence. As soon as I went home and the front door closed, it was a completely different world.
Yeah. It's. I think we're going to see the effects of school closures, not just on you know, in many areas. One of them being this, I think. I wanted to bring in a question from Claire. She's asking about Karma Nirvana. So what Karma Nirvana's current campaigns are around cross-government. So is Karma Nirvana campaigning on current cross-government undermining of human rights in its decision without consultation to create a DA strategy separate to the VAWG strategy? I guess we should unpick what VAWG strategy is. I'll have to claim. There you go. I just wanted to make sure that we got it right.
And Claire, yes, they are. They are campaigning. What I would suggest you do is, if you go to their website, you will. They've done a paper on this, and they're very clear about the campaign. And alongside that, they're campaigning about the raising the age of consent of marriage. So yeah, they are. You know, because they support. They say it is undermining human rights, and to not consult is actually gross negligence as far as I'm concerned, because at the heart of consultation are the voices of victims and survivors. You know, they're those representing victims and survivors, or even consulting with survivors themselves. And I'm an absolute believer in that. That's where you start, with those people that have been affected by it. That needs to happen. So yeah, I agree with what you're saying, and Carmen Nirvana do have a strategy in terms of developing a campaign around this, and it's on their website.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm not sure if it's the same Claire that's asked another question earlier on in our session. Right, so society and agencies in practice are ignorant of the facts, leaving women at increased risk. What else would you advise we do to make these changes happen?
Absolutely. You know, there is almost this, well, from a practitioner's point of view, because they've left, they are now safe. Well, actually, the risk increases to women that leave. And I do think this needs to be part of the conversations around those tables of newly developed domestic abuse partnerships as a result of the bill, where people have got to be highlighting. Then I'm the vice chair of the Domestic Abuse Partnership in Leeds, and I'm certainly going to be highlighting it there. And it's about awareness, isn't it? It's about bringing this to the table and making people aware of this, and also recognizing that within that space, if the risk increases to victims, what resources are we putting in place to protect them and their children? And there's this thing I've seen, this kind of lack of knowledge where if they move city, therefore they're safe. Well, hang on a minute. What about social networking? People think just because physical proximity has changed, somebody is safe. No, that doesn't how it works. That isn't how it works. So I think from a policing perspective, the police need to be more aware of this and the challenges of this for women, because it would normally be policing agencies, I would say, that would be speaking to force areas and having to put in those protective measures. But definitely it needs to be part of the training in terms of awareness.
Thank you. Thank you, Jasvinder. We've got a few minutes left, so I just wanted to see, I know you were involved in advising my colleagues here at DMU when we were setting up the Mandala project. And I think university is another one of those spaces actually where, a little more time is bought, so to speak, in terms of young people facing these sort of coercive home environments. How important do you think something such as Mandala or similar projects are to be embedded within universities and higher education?
Well, I would say they're absolutely imperative, because you're going to have victims in university, and that includes staff as well. Let's be honest about that. And many of these victims of honour abuse and forced marriage, which is what I'm talking about in this context, if they manage to get to university, it's a massive achievement. And that is a place where, they're able to be themselves and able to be free. When they go home, it might be very different for them, and it's almost like a double life. Mm-hmm. So there's a real opportunity to offer them support as they're developing and educating themselves. So for me, the Mandala Project has to reach out to those universities. And and I was on the board of DMU, the board itself also needs to give commitment to a project like Mandala, mm-hmm. in terms of reaching the students out there. And men too, men are also going to be in that place. And it's about awareness of men and women. Yes, I accept male experiences are different, but abuse is abuse. I reconstituted Carmen of Honour in 2008 to start supporting men, because men would call the helpline and we'd have nowhere to refer. And then I recognised and sat with men and heard their experiences, that when it came to a forced marriage, they were not dissimilar to mine. Being forced into marriages as men to hide their sexuality because they were gay men, or having to choose between their family and themselves and their choices because they wouldn't marry. So, I would say the Mandala Project is absolutely imperative, and it is for the university to be thinking about building around that some therapeutic support for those victims. And I would say, and I've recently been linking with a charity called Stand Alone, and they support people who are estranged from their families. And one of their campaigns, and they've managed to get some universities to develop a fund for people who are estranged from their families because they have no family financial support. So, thinking like that as well, to keep that person in university, because if they take a stand against their family, the family may just pull the plug on all support. So what will the university do in that space to help that person stay in education? Yeah,
it's interesting. I made a note. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I just wanted to sort of say a massive thank you. Thank you for a thought-provoking, interesting chat. I think it's one of these kind of topics like this do tend to sit with you for a while, and we reflect and we think, and questions could come up later. This will be available to view back. Obviously, you're able to find you online as well if you wanted to get in touch with you. I know you're active on social media, etc. And also, Carmen Ivana as an organisation local to us here in Leicester in some regards as well. So to really explore some of those themes, I'm sure DMU Women will come back to explore further some of these themes. I wish you all the best with your book. We look forward to seeing that when that comes out as well. And just thank you for the time and for being open and honest about sharing your story with us today. And with that, just want to say thank you. And hand us over to Joe Richardson, who will be introducing our next speaker. So over to you, Joe.
Sunita, thank you very much. And Jasvinder, that was so powerful. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a fascinating morning so far, and this is such an important topic. So thank you very much for that. I am going to be introducing Jess Phillips, and I'm looking forward to a conversation with Jess. Welcome, Jess, to DMU and to this event. Thank you for joining us. Jess Phillips, I think most people are watching will know this, but Jess Phillips is the Labour MP for Birmingham Yardley and is also Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding. So Jess, welcome. I'm going to ask you just a couple of questions just to get the conversation going. And then we'll have some Q&A, which we'll pick up in the chat towards the end of this hour. But I just want to thank you again for joining us today. I'm a bit of a fan. I loved your book, Every Woman. I had the audio version, so I had you in my head for a week whilst I was walking. And I just think it came across, you have such passion to end domestic violence and abuse against women. And, we see this in your book. We see this when you stand up every year in the House of Commons and read out the names of the women who've been killed. That's a very powerful moment, and it's important to remember them. I wonder if you could share with us today where that passion has come from. For example, I want to talk a bit about your experience in working with Women's Aid before you became an MP. So tell us all about it, please, Jess.
Oh, well, thanks very much for having me to start off with. And thank you, Joe. It's a very kind introduction. So where did it come from? I think that, I was raised by feminists, and the women's movement was always very much part of my life, like in a practical way. So I went to Women's Liberation Playgroup that my mum and a load of other women had set up. In order that, because there was no organised childcare back then, there certainly was no state-funded childcare. It wasn't even, that didn't come in until I had my own baby. In fact, my son was the first ever year to have state-funded free childcare under the last Labour government. So it took quite a long time for that idea to catch on. But so I was always surrounded by this powerhouse of women who were helping each other. In order to allow them to get along, whether that was organising childcare, babysitting circles, campaigning about violence and abuse. There was always some group of women doing something in my living room with my mom, like they were going to be activated to do something. So I grew up in that environment. Then many years later, when I had my first baby, I went and worked as a volunteer whilst I was on my maternity leave for a number of different charities that work with refugee women in Birmingham. That was one of the most eye-opening experiences ever. So around the time it was at the end of the civil war in Rwanda and the troubles in Sierra Leone. And Birmingham had quite a big influx at the time of refugees from those areas, and the Congo as well, still deeply problematic, but at the time was kicking loads of people out into our country. The stories that I heard, like running a women mother and baby group amongst these refugee women, the things that they had been through were, I was a young mom and I thought I had it tough because it's hard when you've got a newborn baby. But, these people had suffered rape as a weapon of war. They had almost had no one to rely on. Their status was, deemed lesser than a man. And I because of my experience growing up, I just never really conceptualized, the idea that we have a lesser status in my head until that point. And being a mother, I think, being a young mom, you start to either matter in the world in a way that you didn't matter before in other people's eyes. And that's questionable. And that made me think, hang on a minute, you didn't think anything of me before. And now that I've got a baby, suddenly I'm of use to society. Like my womb makes me a vital person. And so around that time, I started to be like, right, this is what I want to do. I want to work in this field. And then I applied for a job after I'd had my second baby. 3 years later, a job came up in my local women's refuges and sexual violence service, and I applied for a job. And then, it's like a massive education forever. That it will remain the most important job that I have ever done. And I dream one day of going back to it. I really miss it. I really miss doing a shift in refuge. But yeah, the things I saw when I was there, nobody could work in an environment like that, experience the terrible horrors of exploitation, violence, oppression in the streets where we think, we pat ourselves on the back for being a liberal democracy all the time, but there's a huge section of society that are not feeling any level of liberal democracy, and are imprisoned, enslaved, are lesser in society for all sorts of reasons. And at that point I was like, right, I've got to do something about this. I've got to get to the highest point that I can possibly do to do something about this, which led me to the council, then led me to Parliament, and I will keep on going until somebody one day just says, you can be in charge of this now and you get to make all of these decisions.
Fantastic, thank you. I think that's given us a really good glimpse into where you come from professionally, and that strength that you saw when you were growing up, and then seeing that difference with some of the women that you were seeing coming into the refuge and wondering about that. I think that's really compelling, Jess. Thank you. I'm wondering if during your time at Women's Aid, the sort of issues that were coming to light. We've just heard from Jasvinder about her story and about the personal impact and the shame Jasvinder was talking about. I'm just thinking in terms of what you learnt during your time at Women's Aid, some of the sort of the stories that you have kept with you from that time. Perhaps you can talk us through some of those.
There is a couple of cases that stay with you, and you deal, in any 1 year that I was working at what is now Black Country Women's Aid, we would have seen around 8,000 to 10,000 cases, adult cases, let alone the cases of children associated with those adults. You're talking 16,000. So at least, so you're talking thousands of people. And so actually sometimes that, there's lots of cases, and they're not all going to stay with you, but there is always, the 5 to 10 cases that build you into the person and create a sort of battleground that must be changed. But sometimes it is the cases, but also just the sheer volume. I think that people, the Black Country, it's like less than half the size of Birmingham, where I live. And yet I'm talking about the cases that came forward that we were handling were tens of thousands every year. So scale that up. And the volume becomes almost like you can't see the wood for the trees. And that is a thing that drives me as well, the sheer number. But some of the cases, Jasvinder, absolutely right to talk about shame. The saddest thing that you used to see, and I still see it today, because I still handle lots and lots of cases of domestic violence as a constituency member of Parliament, is the brilliant job that perpetrators, backed up by society, have been able to do to convince the people involved that it's their fault. And so you'd be talking to a woman in refuge, and she'd been there for 2 months, and you're trying to do all that reprogramming, like you're a good mom, actually this was taken away from you. It's not that you did anything wrong, it's that this power was taken away from you. And so your ability, for example, to discipline your children was removed from you because you were seen as a second-class citizen in your house. There's all sorts of things that have to be relearned. But it will take years actually for an individual to learn that they have self-esteem, that they should have self-esteem, that it wasn't their fault, because society tells them it was, and most of the people they come across tell them that we back up the idea that the perpetrator has. So a good example, and Jasvinder will see lots of these cases, is our immigration system. So our immigration system will bring people over, will allow people to be brought into this country to be on spousal visas, and if they are then abused, their perpetrator will say to them, "Oh, if you tell anyone, I'll have you deported." And then what happens when they tell someone is they get put in detention centres, immigration detention centres, or the Home Office seeks to try and deport them. I've had many, many cases like that. So we basically say, "Oh, your perpetrator was right. You better stay with him because, oh dear, yeah, it does look like we'd rather deport someone because to make our figures look good than protect a victim of domestic abuse." Similarly, children's social care, you see that all the time where people say, well, if you don't do this to the mother, then we're going to take your children away. And what the perpetrator says to a victim is, if you do this, they'll take the kids away. And then we go, you know what, he's bloody right, we will. The whole system is set up to encourage the things that perpetrators say, that women are sexualized objects, that women are lesser, that women won't be able to survive financially, and then the state and the system that they come into continues to perpetuate that. And the society that they live in tells them that they're lesser, that they're a sexual object, that that's their worth. And so the cases that I saw were when somebody literally sits and says they are worthless and they deserve to be enslaved, that they're good for nothing else. Victims of human trafficking who said things to me like, "Oh, I'm good for nothing." Well, what other skills have I got other than being forced to have sex with 14 men every day? What else am I going to do? And it's because somebody had told them their whole life that that was their only worth, and that the only thing they were good for was to have sex with for money. And when they repeat that themselves, that we have so much work cut out for us as a society to make people question what they're being told by people who are exploiting them and abusing them. And those are the cases that stayed with me. The case I handled, in fact, I referred to the young woman this morning. There's one young woman who was there throughout the whole period that I was at Women's Aid, in and out of every single service, originally in a children's service, then in sexual violence service, in domestic abuse services. She went through every single one. And this kid had been failed by literally every single, her parents had failed her, the care system had failed her, every partner she'd had been abusive, like every single person this kid had come across was abusive. She'd had children removed from her, rightly so. I wouldn't criticise that particularly, but the cycle just kept on continuing. And she was she will remain forever my inspiration. When people say, "Oh, who's your political inspiration?" and they expect me to say Barbara Castle, it was this kid who got up every single day and survived the kind of thing that would make, if you were to try and write a drama about it, people would say it would be too much. This would be unbelievable that this amount of things could happen to a kid, that, you were abused by your relatives as a child. You were then groomed into sex work as a teenager. You were then prostituted out by the man you'd married. It's almost unbelievable, the idea that this could go on. But she was always, she was a pain in the ass, don't get me wrong, a lot of the time. She wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But she got up every day. She bothered to get up and come in and say, "Can I use the phone? I need to ring the social," or, I don't know that I'd get up anymore. I think I just think it would have killed me, what happened to her. And so that's what a survivor is. That is what genuinely, that's inspiring to me, that she was able to survive through all of that.
Absolutely. I mean, there are some really shocking cases that we hear, and I think you're right. It's those everyday kind of stories. It's not necessarily political elite or high profile figures that are the ones who inspire us to keep going. It's those who are already keeping going on an everyday basis in your constituency, people that you see every day that probably affect the most. So
Yeah, totally. People who smile. I mean, there's a one woman called Anne who comes into my constituency office. She's not been abused, as best I know. But she comes in and my office, like, I love my constituency and I love Birmingham. I'm not one of those members of parliament who can stand up and say that I represent the most beautiful area in the world. I don't. I represent a largely industrialised area of Birmingham. It's not easy on the eye in the most part. And my office is in this run of shops that is quite run down and it's got all potholes out the front. There's a woman called Anne comes into my office for a cup of tea sometimes and she's just like, oh, it's such a beautiful spot. And I'm like, it's really not a beautiful spot, Anne, but thanks for being just like, being happy with your lot and just keeping going and trying to find the happiness in things, especially at the moment. Anne is my touchstone.
I think that's so important, and it, as they say, she is in the eye of the beholder. And I think if you can find the beauty in wherever you are to keep you going, particularly in these strange times during lockdown and the pandemic, to have that fortitude to keep smiling and keep going. And as you say, with the other woman in your constituency, to just keep turning up and ask to use the phone and put one foot in front of the other. I think that's incredible. And as you say, I'm not entirely sure I know whether I would have the strength to draw on. So I think that's such a powerful story, and I can quite understand why it's what keeps you going, Jess, in terms of trying to fight this. I'm just wondering if maybe you could talk us through whereabouts you think things are now in terms of what we're doing in terms of legislation with domestic violence, the bill, that sort of thing. So you talked about structural elements of the society that helps kind of keep this going. The fact that we're deporting people when we should be helping and protecting. So where are we now in terms of your fight on this, Jess?
We're better, than we've ever been, is the truth. Both as a society, we're better than we've ever been. And, there's 100,000 people dead. I don't want to even say that there could ever be any silver lining to the particular cloud. But I think that lockdown has massively advanced the societal feelings about domestic abuse. We've all had a universal experience. As a socialist, I believe in the sort of universal nature of policy and the importance of universality. We've all had this universal experience, and for the first time ever, just everybody recognised their privilege with regards to domestic abuse, without having to be said, oh, you need to recognise your privilege, and having people telling you that. People would just say things like, God, it's hard, but can you imagine if you were living with somebody who was beating you up? Or can you imagine if you were living in a tower block with 3 kids and you didn't have a garden space? Like, people really were grateful for what they had in the first lockdown, and people also really understood how terrifying this would be for people who were in dangerous and abusive homes. And that has been, I think, it has advanced something that was slowly advancing. It advanced it hugely, and so that's a real positive society-wise. Also on the immigration thing, I think that understanding that our health service was staffed by migrants, we came quite a long way on in that conversation, when it was just sort of like, what, we're trying to deport the people who are currently putting their lives on the line to service. And it's like, yes, we are, that's what we do. So that was I think that was an advancement as well. But we be careful. We 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Always there will be some backlash to both of those things that I've said that will be orchestrated. But legislatively wise, again, we are better than we have ever been, because the public care about it because of huge amounts of work to talk about it more. And I will take a tiny fraction of the credit, and I do it with a massive team of activists and agencies, and we're always constantly trying to raise it. Jasvinder is a really good example of one of those people. But so we for the first time ever, women matter as much as bins in local authorities. The legislation will now put women on a legal footing in local councils. Women victims of domestic abuse will matter as much as collecting the bins. And that's, real progress for people like me to be happy about. But, before there was no legal framework that they had to provide refuge accommodation, and now there will be. And I never thought I'd achieve that, so I feel pretty chuffed about that. But still, we've got masses of way to go. The place we fall down in legislation always is the bit where we get very meek about where it crosses over with other things, where domestic violence crosses over with other things that the establishment, the power brokers in this country feel misty-eyed about. So parenthood is one of them, and the idea of the role of a father in a family is very, 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 very quick. How many people yesterday? There was a debate about grooming gangs in Westminster, and I went down, and Tory man after Tory man stood up and referred to these people as being monsters. Quite rightly so. I have no criticism with that. They said, look, these are not grooming gangs, these are rapists, these are monsters, these are criminals, and they're absolutely right on that. And then what I would say back to them is that Parliament has repeatedly, even though we've put down amendments, we've tried to change the legislation for the past 5 years, I've been trying to change the legislation that says that those monsters shouldn't have just an automatic assumption that if they parent a child that they have a right to see that child. And every single one of those Tory men who stood up and said that yesterday would be squeamish about the idea that I think that the presumption of contact should be stopped. You shouldn't be able to presume that you have a right to contact a child if you are a rapist, a child rapist. In the case of Sammy Woodhouse, which I read out yesterday, Sammy Woodhouse was one of the Rotherham victims. She was raped from the age of 14, repeatedly by the same man. She was pregnant twice, but she has a son, and her rapist is in prison and is encouraged by the system that we have at the moment, and has literally been encouraged to have access to her son, born of rape. And we're too meek to say that that's not okay, because we're terrified of the idea that we're saying that it's as if when I'm saying rapists shouldn't be able to see their children, that they're hearing is all men are rapists, and that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying all men shouldn't have a right to their children. I'm saying people who perpetrate domestic abuse, sexual violence, child grooming shouldn't have I'm not saying they shouldn't see their children. I'm saying they shouldn't have an automatic right and a presumption to see their children. And that's where we fall down. We fall down the immigration system. The Tories don't want to be seen as being bad to victims of domestic violence, and they really don't anymore. They've made real progress on that. But they don't mind being seen as being bad to migrant victims. In fact, every single time I criticise them for deporting people or for basically making people destitute through the no recourse to public fund situation. So, for example, for any students watching, foreign students is a really good example. If you're a foreign student in this country, you're studying here, you could well be the person inventing the next vaccine in this country, and you have no recourse to public funds. And if your partner rapes you, beats the shit out of you, in our country at the moment, you do not have the right to enter into a refuge. You will not be given the resource by the state in this country to go into a refuge. That is wrong. That is fundamentally wrong. And it leaves people Well, it leaves people dead, is what it does. But every time I criticise the government on that, they like it. They like the fact that they are mean to migrant communities. They enjoy me saying it. And so you end up at a terrible impasse. So in that regard, we're nowhere forward. We're in a worse situation than we were. With welfare, we're in a worse situation than we were. With housing, we're in a worse situation than we were. But the legislation, the words on paper, rather than the practice, they are much better. And society is much better.
Thank you for that. I think that's really interesting. And the notion of the sort of dog whistle politics that means that what should be a harsh criticism is taken as a badge of honour is frankly shameful. But yeah, it's really important.
It's very hard to fight. How do you fight when your fight makes them happy? You know, I could sit there and call them all sorts of terrible names and they'd be like, yeah, we're winning. Terrible. I just want them to basically give a shit about people who've been raped. And I don't care what stamp is in the passport of the person who has been raped and abused. I want to make sure that we help them. And I want to make sure that when we help them, we put their perpetrators in prison. Their attitude to migrant victims of domestic abuse, it's making our country less safe for the British people, for the people with the right stamp in their passport. You know, it's leaving violent abusers who are British and sexual offenders on our streets. So it's a terrible situation, and they shouldn't be proud of it, but yet they are.
Yeah, and that must be difficult to try and fight that each day. But thank you for doing it. I'm going to turn now, because you mentioned some of the practical structural things that happen. So on paper, we're moving forward, you know, potentially as a society, we're moving forward in the way we frame this and we look at this. I've got a housing background. Before I kind of fell into academia, I on purpose went into social housing to be a housing officer, and on a few occasions dealt with homelessness applications as a result of domestic and family violence. So have some practical experience of that, but from quite a long time ago now. There's lots that we can do, and I work with amazing colleagues. So I work with a colleague called Alison Inman, and also Kelly Henderson, and they are both instrumental in terms of really making it clear. They are brilliant, aren't they? But in the social housing world, you know, I think they're absolutely brilliant. Kelly and others have set up the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, and this is really because we can be there, kind of social housing officers. They're there every day. They're kind of they can see where things might be going wrong. And with the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, there are various tactics that housing organisations can implement. You know, it could be that if someone's reporting a broken door or something, rather than seeing that as a repair, you can see it as a clue that there's something else going on. So I think it's such important work. I'm just wondering, what do you think, what role do you think industries like the social housing sector, or indeed the higher education sector, what do you think we need to consider to do more to help stop domestic violence against women?
I mean, I think that the DAHA, the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, is a really, really brilliant example, and not just in what they're doing practically on the ground. They worked with a brilliant woman, Goody, and you know Alison and Goody, you know, they're not just helping change policy on the ground of housing associations. I have sat opposite with them, opposite ministers of state, and they have changed the law. There is now housing law, and domestic abuse has come on in the past 3 or 4 years because of them. So they do so much. And what it is, I mean, I can't help but say that when women are in positions of leadership, things get better for women. That there is no better example than Alison's role, then changing literally a sort of area where people just went, oh, well, you know, like ASB was always the big ticket, antisocial behaviour was always the big ticket in town. And now I feel like domestic abuse it's like we're as important as the bins, we're as important as the kid next door who kicks a ball against the wall now. it's like slowly but surely the issues that affect women get to the forefront. So one thing that organisations can do is employ more women and put them into senior positions, because usually what that means is then they cater for different things that society needs. But the DAHA, what it shows and what is that it is everybody's business. I remember once when I was on Birmingham City Council, when I was a councillor, I did training with all sorts of different departments in the council about, what would you do if someone came forward to you? Much broader than like the housing officers, who definitely would have seen it, welfare officers, and other people. But, like literally everybody, the people who talk to you about your council tax, the people who are talking to you about your fencing, like you say, like so I did this training, and this one woman said to me, well, I work in accounts. Why is it ever going to knock on my door? I said, if your sister came round later and said, my husband's been beating me up, would you say, well, I'm sorry, I work in accounts? You wouldn't, would you? You'd act like a human being. You'd go, God, like, let's try. You don't be like, oh, sorry, not my business, I work in fisheries. It's just like, no, but humans don't behave like that in real life. Yet when we're given a job at work or a role for an institution or an organisation, we immediately go, well, that's not my problem. And if you work with people, you work with victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence. The end. And so what is your strategy to take part in the fight? It's everybody's business. So, and that's more so than just saying, oh, we're going to put up a helpline number in the student union, or in the block of flats common room, we're going to put up a number. Is what are we actually going to do to make sure that people can come forward, that actually we're seeking people out, rather than just waiting constantly for victims to do all of the bloody work. Like, what are we doing proactively, like the broken door example? How are we asking our students? If a midwife will say to you, now, I remember my midwife asking my husband to leave the room, for example, while she spoke to me. She said, I just want to ask you these questions. Now that was, that didn't used to exist, and then it existed, and that will have found hundreds of thousands of victims in the years since that policy change. Don't be afraid to ask the questions. It's, as somebody who isn't a victim of domestic abuse, I'm not offended when people ask me if I am. I'm not like, how could you say that about my husband? He's the greatest man alive. I just go, oh, no, honestly, I'm fine. It's not like, we've got to stop being squeamish about the idea that these people are hard to reach. They're not hard to reach. We just don't bother to try. When people say to me, oh, it's really hard to get people to come forward, isn't it? I'm just like, it isn't. I'll be in Sainsbury's and a woman, because she will recognise me and know that I care about this because I've been very vocal, will come up and tell me about her rape. I've been told about people's rapes at children's birthday parties. People are constantly seeking me out to tell me their issues because I made myself available. Like, make yourself available as an organisation. What are you going to do to make yourself available? And then just know what to do next. And if you find that you've opened a door to an empty room because the services aren't there, then do what Alison did, and Goody and Gusty and all those people who worked in housing that you have identified. Go and demand that there should be services there. Join with demand it and sit in front of ministers and say, well, actually, no, we're going to have it, or fund a service if you're a big institution that can afford it. You don't need to wait. Organisations will lend you a worker if you pay for one. They will train one up for you and live on your campus and help your people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think at the university, DMU is we're pretty good, in this area already, in terms of the Mandala project, the No Space for Hate strategy. I think across the sector, I'm sure there are other universities who are including initiatives like this. And our strategies at the moment very student facing, which is absolutely right. And I think we're looking to broaden that out and make sure that includes our staff as well. So I think we're already making good steps, but it's really important, as you say, to utilize the expertise of specific workers and to make that at the heart of it and to be available. So that's what I've taken away from your answer to that question. I work with as part of my research, I work with groups that are seen as hard to reach, and as you say, nobody is hard to reach. It's about being there and asking the question.
People say hard to reach about all Black and Asian people. I'm like, they're not hard to reach. They live next door. Just knock on their door. Like, it's a terribly lazy language. I understand that we need that language. It's like BAME. It's like all of those things. Like we needed that language in a sort of social policy in order to do something about it. It's rooted in a good thing, in good, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And the idea that we're making special efforts to reach groups that aren't necessarily attracted by the mainstream offer, but that's on us. Like, we make out like it's their fault. Like, well, they're very hard to reach. It's like, they're really not. Go and talk to them. Go and knock on their doors. They're not monsters. You can just chat with people and say, oh, have you ever suffered domestic abuse? If you say that to any woman, they will either be like, oh, they won't be offended. They will either have a story to tell, or they won't be sure. They'll be like, well, I definitely had someone who wasn't cracking to me at some point, or, but no, nothing physical is often what they'll say, but nobody goes, it's very rude of you to ask me this question. Literally no one has ever said that to me. No one has ever taken offence at my asking, is everything all right at home?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And earlier on in the talk, you talked about we need to be less squeamish. So let's not be meek and squeamish in terms of what our own individual agency is as either employees or students at the university, or as an MP, or working for Women's Aid. It's stepping out of the meek and squeamish zone and getting into the, knocking on doors and saying, have you been abused? And as you say, if you've never had anyone say, I'm offended at that, that just goes to show that hopefully any of us can step into that role and ask the question and see what comes back. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to still reveal myself as a bit of a fan now, because I'm going to talk a bit about, or turn to your book, Truth to Power, which I also really like. And you talk about stepping up or staying silent, which speaks a little bit to what we've just been saying. So the mission that I have with my fabulous co-chair, Yasmin Ali, we co-chair DMU Women. Our mission is to amplify voices through connection. And we aim to do this not just for staff, but for students, alumni, stakeholders in the city. We see that as a collective for DMU Women. And I'm just wondering if you've got some top tips for us on what we can do as a network to help women feel confident to speak out and step up.
I mean, you're just existing, you're already doing half the job, like bothering to create something, and not to be disheartened by sometimes the slow progress that these things can take. Like, people are like, right, let's do something, and then like only 4 people turn up and you get a bit like, oh gosh, maybe nobody cares about this. Well, that pushing through that barrier, that sort of both embarrassment and like immediately I'm doing something wrong, which everybody is a sort of terribly British and very, very female thing to do, and pushing through that and trying to make something work is, all power to your elbow, because you've done the hard. Actually, that's the hardest thing. That the hardest bit is putting yourself out there and saying something exists. It's really, I still find it really, really hard to do things like that. Even though I've done it so many times in lots of different ways, it's still hard. But I think that one of the most important things to do, I think, is ask the people who you seek to help. Like I say, that just asking people what exactly it is that what is holding them back, and then I suppose sort of forcing the hand of people, like volunteering people for things. I mean, I'm a member of Parliament because somebody volunteered me for it. I mean, I became a counsellor because somebody rang up and just was like, oh, I put your name down on this list because we need a woman. It's an all women shortlist, and there isn't one. And I was just like, what? I've just had a baby. I was like, this is mental. Don't do this. Like I was just like, okay. And I was delighted, in fact, but somebody else had volunteered me to do it. And we have this thing called Ask Her to Stand, because it takes women, we need, for some reason, to seek permission to do things in a way. And I can't say whether men do or don't feel like this, because I'm not one and I don't have the experience of being one. And I wish my sons would ask me for permission to do anything. They don't. But I'm not going to suggest that is in any way an empirical study. They might just be naughty. But women need to be given permission. Like, I needed to be told that it would be a good idea that I stand for election. I needed to be told that I was good at something, and therefore that somebody was going to say, actually, you're really good in the meetings, Jess. You're better at speaking up than some of the other people. So I tell you what, if we do this bit, why don't you do that bit? And people are doing it without even realizing is that what that does is that gives you permission to do it. So what you need to do as a network is find groups of people who will be the person who gives the other person permission. So find out what the things that people want to do and feel that they're not good at, and then find someone to tell them that they are good at it, even if they're not. Because men turn up who are not good at things. Like Rishi Sunak, it's literally like, at the moment, he's like the golden boy. Like, he's got huge amounts of PR behind him. Now, I've sat opposite Rishi Sunak and listened to him read out a speech. He cannot ad-lib for 1 second. He sticks to the script that has been written by him. And yet I'm being told he's literally like the promised land by the newspapers. And it's just like, I mean, he can read out loud. So well done. I'm not criticizing his ability to read out loud, but it's like, why am I being told that this is an amazing politician? He just can read out loud. Like, that isn't that, I mean, it's better than the Prime Minister who can't read out loud. So that maybe that there's one could understand, but he didn't have to be given permission. Whereas you're probably much better at reading out loud than you think, or speaking in a meeting, or you're the brilliant person who's going to come up with the ideas, and there's another brilliant person who's going to front it. But we need to all just be giving each other permission constantly.
I think that's really helpful. This idea of needing permission, I certainly feel like I do in my professional life still. There's something about seeking reassurance or permission. Collectively, we need to not give each other permission, because that's kind of reinforcing that you need to seek it, but kind of champion, cheerlead one another. And another thing I think maybe is ask for help more often. I don't know if you know, there's an organisation called Camarados. It's led by Math Potts, who's a bit of an inspiration, and it's about seeking connection. So it was public living rooms before the lockdown, and now it's virtual public living rooms. And his premise is that if you see somebody who you think needs help, ask them to help you. And it's almost it's that, then that unlocks people's ability to do things, step forward. So instead of offering to support, you're saying, please, could you help me with this? And I think that's a different way of giving permission without saying you need to have permission to do something.
It's a really funny thing in society that we all love helping other people. Like, I love it when someone asks me to help them. I say yes to everything. Like the smallest thing to the biggest thing, I'm like, yeah, go on then, I'll do it. Like, I really love it when someone asks me to help them. I feel good. It makes me feel good. And yet I hate asking people for help. Like, I really had to be taught that politically. Like, so people come into my constituency office and you will have got them a new house or something, like you had them moved out of the hotel they were living in and they're, you know, with their 3 kids, and you finally got them on the housing list, or you've sorted out some, you know, a quicker doctor's appointment for someone's mom or something. And they always say, "Is there ever anything I can do for you?" And they mean it. And yet you go, "Thanks very much, don't worry about it." But they mean it. And actually a way to help them further would be to let them help me. So I had to learn to say, okay, well, actually, would you mind delivering some leaflets down your street about what's going on in the local neighbourhood? And they were like, yeah, of course I would, I'd love to. And it like makes them feel better. But, you know, you're not a burden. The people who are a burden, as to me, as a constituency member of parliament, like, you know, they are never ever the people who have the greatest needs. The people who are having the hardest time are always the happiest to help. The most generous people are the people with the least. Often it is just, you know, it's phenomenal how much that marries up. People who go like, well, I don't want to moan, and then they're like, but you know, I've basically been living, you know, and the water in my house for the past 3 weeks is up to my knees, and you're like, yeah, it's really okay for you to moan about that. Whereas somebody else will just literally ring you every single day because there is a crack on a paving stone outside their house, and it's like, it's a funny old world.
Yeah, it certainly is. I should think perspective is something that's top of the list of your ingredient cupboard when it comes to being a constituency MP. Thank you so much for that. I think that's been really helpful. We're going to move on to a wider Q&A in a moment. I can see a couple of comments in the chat. So if I look as if I'm looking to the side, Jess, it's because I'm trying to keep up with the chat. But just before we do that, you mentioned much earlier, and you said, you know, you've gone from Women's Aid to being an MP and now Shadow Minister, and you're really making such a difference. But you also said your eventual goal is to kind of just be put in charge of this, to be able to do something about it. So let's say you are in charge. What are your hopes for the future on this issue? And also, how can we at DMU support you?
So, well, I mean, my hopes for the future, I wouldn't ever be so lofty as to suggest that we can eradicate violence against women and girls, because until women are equal in society, we won't eradicate it. We won't eradicate child abuse for the same reason. It's about power and who holds power in a country. But you know, I'd like domestic abuse services and sexual violence services to be considered the same way we consider health services. So you get this a lot with mental health services, like the idea of parity of esteem. I'd like them not to be rationed. I'd like them to be available to everybody who needs them, and that's housing, policing, specialist services. Whereas currently we exist in a world where 1 in 4 people will be able to get a brilliant end-to-end service at any one time. Now, imagine if that was diabetes, and so imagine a victim of domestic violence had diabetes, and first of all, when they went to the doctor, they said, "Oh, sorry, you've come in at 4, and I've diagnosed 8 people already today with diabetes, and so we just don't have the insulin to offer you until you're about to die. At the moment you're having a hyperglycemic shock, at that moment we will give it to you. We will make sure that actually we'll spend millions swooping in at that point. But you're just going to have to wait until you're nearly dead." And that's what we do to victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence in this country. We go, "Oh, sorry, you're not quite risky enough. You're not quite abused enough to reach this particular threshold to get any service. So, sorry, there's no bed for you tonight. There's no, you know, you're on the waiting list though. Don't worry." That's what we do, and until it is considered a service that has to be provided, then I will keep on banging on that particular drum. And I recognise that is expensive and it's difficult, and there will always be things that fall through the net, just like there's always things that fall through the net in our NHS. No, I'm not asking for perfect. I'm asking to not be treated as if it's a luxury that can go to some people. And so that's the aim. And what can DMU to do? I mean, there is a huge because there is always legislation going through. So there's all of the stuff that you can do around researching the things that need changing is really, really important. And lobbying the government, whether that's through petitioning, whether that's through research papers, holding events and things that we all have to. It's everybody's business, and making out that everybody cares about it. The government care about stuff that everybody cares about. That's like their whole. Not just this government, any government, politicians, all of us. We like the public to like us. I don't know where we've gone wrong. They largely hate us, but that's like our gig. We need people to vote for us. So if the people care about it, politicians will care about it. Whilst bins are more of an electoral issue, and they are, your bin not being collected, you'll lose an election. The local council will lose an election. Your women being left on the streets, not so much. We have to make people care about it as much as they care about their bin collectors.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I mean, we've got quite a good collection of research, certainly on this issue. My colleague Mel Crofts, who opened this event, works with Vanessa Bettinson and others in a research group that connects on this. And I think this is the importance of impact from research. So rather than doing the research for the sake of exploring an issue, it's then on us to connect with stakeholders, a wide range of stakeholders, and to help translate the research in effect to see how it can be practically applicable immediately. And I think that's what we do, and we need to keep on doing more of that. So thank you ever so much for that, Jess. I'm going to move on to some of the Q&A I can see in the chat. And the first question I've got here is from Claire. And Claire says, what are Jess's thoughts on the current cross-government, on the current government undermining on human rights in its decision without consultation to create a domestic abuse strategy separate to a violence against women and girls strategy? So just wondered what your thoughts are on there from Claire.
My thoughts, I imagine, from the way that question is framed, is the same as the questioner. I am against it. I'm against having a separate domestic abuse strategy without the violence against women and girls strategy, because I don't think that you can separate the two. For a start off, just as one example, 56% of victims of domestic violence suffer sexual violence as a pattern of their domestic abuse. The vast majority of rape in this country happens within domestic, what we would call a domestic setting, within interfamiliar relationships. So there's just one example of an enormous crossover. But the reason, I think, okay, I'm going to not be cynical about the government now. I think that the reason that they have done it is because they have a domestic abuse commissioner, who, funnily enough, I think would agree with me in what I just said. But they have a domestic abuse commissioner, and domestic abuse is an area where they do care about it. I don't wish to present that the ministers don't care about it. They definitely do, for the right reasons and for cynical political reasons, but for the right reasons, they do care about it. And I think that they have got into a place where they're comfortable legislating around it in a sort of criminal justice way, hard on crime sort of thing, which, I'm not against. And they need to sort of separate it from the very sticky and very badly managed as a nation sexual violence, child sexual abuse, FGM, where convictions are terrible. They need to sort of hive it off for success reasons as well, and focus, actually, to be even less cynical. I think that they really feel like they want to focus on it. Now, if I was being completely cynical, it's because they want to degender it and make it out like that it isn't an issue, that they don't want the word woman in it. And they don't want the word woman in it because they've been lobbied very, very successfully by all those men who stood up yesterday and talked about trends. Amazingly, yesterday in the debate about grooming gangs, there were lots and lots of people who wished to stress the trends within ethnic groups as perpetrators. Not one of them stood up and said anything about the fact that the vast majority of all perpetrators of this are men. So as men standing up saying, we've got to do something about this group, not including themselves in this group. And that is, it's a real concern, the idea that we want to undo the understanding that domestic violence is a gendered crime, because it is.
Thank you. That was a really full answer. So yeah, thank you very much for that, Jess. The next question I'm moving on to is from Jasvinder, who says that they agree with you about the hard to reach groups point and this blaming point. But the question is say that COVID has negatively impacted women's careers. How can the government help with this?
Oh God, well, they could just do something, couldn't they? That would be good. Get some more women in prominent positions of power, so that when you make new laws that change everybody's liberty overnight, you remember that more than half of the population of the country have a different anatomy, because women's childcare was never considered, that women's work was never considered. And in the last few weeks, honestly, if I hear another Tory saying we'd like to thank all the working parents, I don't want thanks. I want action about, I have friends who have had to give up their jobs to look after their children. I'm lucky that my children are older, and the one time that, sort of being a young mom has finally paid off is that my kids can look after themselves while I work. That wouldn't, had I had my children when the average woman now has her children, I would have like a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. So, it just is, there are two groups in my view who deserve, for want of a better word, reparations from what has occurred economically and socially because of COVID-19, putting aside the massive health inequalities that have been shown up for poorer communities and Black and Asian communities in this country. That putting aside that particular issue, which I think is well discussed, and there definitely needs to be something done about those health inequalities going forward. And I think potentially that argument has won. But economically and socially, we have put women's work back to the 1970s, if not the 50s, actually. In the very early stages, I was speaking to women who were furloughed when none of the men in their organisation had been furloughed. I'm now speaking to women who are being forced into work while their children are at home and they're begging for furlough. At every stage, it has been as crap as it possibly can be for women, especially carers, of both professional carers, in fact, who get paid poorly, and unpaid carers, who are largely women. Something like 4.8 million people in the United Kingdom have as extra 4.8 million carers than there were at the unpaid carers than there were at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think nearly 60% of them are women. So it's a massive thing. But the other group as well is children and young people. We owe them a debt. We owe women's work a debt, and we owe children and young people a debt, and that debt has to be repaid. So there needs to be specific job creation. There needs to be specific targeted schemes for women's work, not just a little pilot here or there. There needs to be a nationwide targeted women's work scheme, because when they do apprenticeship schemes, for example, the vast majority of the powerful and good apprenticeships go to men. So there needs to be something specifically targeted at women. I don't want your thanks. Thank you, Rishi Sunak. I want action. I don't want you to say, oh, with thanks to the parents. No, and thanks to the kids. It's not enough. And we need to have specific targeted catch-up, educational things, but also for those leaving both university and leaving university, going to university, leaving school, there's going to have to be targeted approaches for the employment and the employability of those people.
Yeah, totally agree. I think we're quite good at inexpensive thanks during this COVID-19 crisis. As much as it's a fantastic sentiment to do the clapping for the NHS staff, actually what people need is support, PPE and proper pay, and not to be under threat of deportation or, all of these things which are instrumental to a successful life and a happy life.
Deeply patronising for male politicians or politicians without children to stand up. I mean, a nice young Tory woman, to be fair to her, she said it to me on a TV programme the other day, I want to thank the parents. And I just thought, it's so patronising as well. It's just sort of like, oh, thanks, we know it's been tough. It's just like, oh, stop patronising me, and stop people like Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson saying thank you to the parents. What you mean why don't you talk about what you haven't done? Actually, we would move the dial considerably further if we said, do you know what? Actually, as a man who had to work throughout this crisis, it wasn't me who looked after my children. It wasn't me. Do you know what? We'd move the dial considerably further if instead of your patronising thanks. I mean, Dominic Cummings literally drove hundreds of miles because he was scared of having to look after a child on his own.
Yeah. Good point.
That is my feelings on that.
Yeah, okay, yeah. And I think we've got the evidence as well. Yasmin and I are both involved in WEN, which is the Women in Higher Education Network, and they've produced a report called Sharing the Caring, and it shows the evidence that we know already, that women are, as they have always borne the brunt of the unpaid domestic labour. This is really amplified during COVID-19. It brings me on to my next question. I've got two more questions for you before we wrap up, Jess. The next question is from Olivia, and she's asked about how has COVID-19 impacted domestic violence? What forms of abuse have been happening, and has the abuse changed? So we know that it's perhaps hidden more, and it's more difficult to help resolve if people aren't there doing the frontline jobs in person. But just wondering if there are any other observations you've had during COVID-19 on DV.
Well, unfortunately, actually, the pandemic directly has been used by perpetrators to abuse. So we saw huge amounts of the sort of family court abuse that goes on, withholding children or withholding financing of your children. So through the child support agency, in cases of domestic abuse, it was very, very, because these things had to change very quickly overnight. Like the rules around if you have your children on a court order at the weekend and you get COVID-19, what are you meant to do? Like none of those questions were asked when the rules were put in place. Again, because there were no women in the room, I would have asked them. And so there was a void that was left where perpetrators would withhold children, so arguably kidnap in some cases, say, well, actually we've all got the virus, you can't come near us, or saying we've got the virus, you're going to have to move back in with us. There was quite a lot of, and if a woman is separated from her children because she's been forced to by the family courts, and her children are with a person who was violent towards her at a weekend, and he says, well, we're having to isolate, you would move back in. I would move back in, because I would want to be near my children who I'd want to protect. I've seen incidences of people being threatened to be infected with the virus as a pattern of domestic abuse. It's been able to be used, obviously, as a you can't go out because of this. So those sorts of things, it really, really ramped up the ability to isolate somebody and use it. Quite a lot of women having to sort of take up, like the CSA, the Child Support Agency, just immediately said anyone who says that they can't pay because of COVID, that we're just going to accept it, which I can sort of understand, because lots of people were losing their jobs, but actually that's left thousands of women destitute with their children, with fathers not paying their way when they may well have just lost their job as well. So the CSA considered it from the point of the payee, not the child, which, you know, is a really, really dangerous situation. It's as if women don't work and just receive money from men. It's just like, no, they may also be in an economic bind as well. It's crackers, absolutely crackers, that is still the mindset. So there's been lots and lots of ways that the pandemic has worsened incidences.
Yeah, thank you for that. We're on our last quick question, Jess, before we wrap up. And question is from Lucy, who says, what can we do as an individual to raise awareness of DV? So we've talked about strategic and organisational level interventions, but as an individual, what can we do to help raise awareness of this and the importance of refuges?
I think that, I mean, as an individual, again, you can start, there's petitions. So the migrant women thing that I talked about, we have a petition on my website that is called No Victim Left Behind, which is about making our laws inclusive for migrant victims, disabled victims, LGBT. Like, there's loads of gaps really still in our services, older victims of domestic abuse, harrowingly so. So there's always campaign groups. 38 Degrees do quite a lot of stuff on domestic abuse, so as an individual you can always lend your name and time to that. But actually the most important thing that we can do as individuals is talk about it with people. Is similar to making yourself available, like, you know, talk about your own experiences in order to invite other people's experiences who might want to talk about it, but also point out when things are wrong, because lots of people have poor, I mean, I think just educate yourself on why women don't leave. And so when people say, oh God, you know, I think I probably would have left and that wouldn't have happened to me, they mean it deeply, with, you know, kindly, but it still blames the victim. So educate yourself on the reasons why women don't leave these situations. And when you hear people wrongly say, oh, you know, imagine, you know, that she did end up twice with a violent man, you know, she can't half pick them, that you can say, well, actually, all the statistics show that if you've been abused in childhood or in early adulthood, you're much more likely to end up in an abusive relationship because of the things that you've learned. So actually it's not the fault of the person at all. And just be there. You know, when people say stupid things in the pub and things, like I've heard men, you know, talking about, I've heard people I know and love talking about people being drunk, like hideously drunk, and then their mates having sex with them. And you know, it's on all of us to say, do you know, that's not okay. Actually, talk to them about consent. You know, we need to be talking about it in our lives.
Yeah, I think that's really important. We can all contribute. As you say, we can educate ourselves. We can ask questions. How are you? Are you going through this? We can be less squeamish and we can stand up. So I think really, really important points. Fantastic to talk with you, Jess. Thank you very, very much for giving up your time to be with us here today for this event. It's been wonderful to hear from Jess Phillips. It's been wonderful to hear from Jasvinder earlier. So on behalf of me and Yasmin Ali, my co-chair at DMU Women, and from all of us here at DMU, thank you, Jess. Thank you, Jasvinder, and thank you to everyone for participating and asking questions. Thank you all very much, and bye-bye.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.